This is a very fascinating period politically in Delhi because though the Mughal emperor, in many ways symbolically, was still important as a Mughal emperor in the sense that a lot of Indian powers, the Marathas, the Rajputs, the various successor states, as we call them, were still acknowledging the Mughal emperor as the legitimate sovereign.
Historian Swapna Little's latest book, The Broken Script, published by Speaking Tiger, brings to life a short but crucial period in Delhi's history. The book describes the early 19th century in Delhi when the Mughals were a power, but just in name, and the English East India Company were the real rulers of the city. She also talks about how the lives of the people in Delhi changed during this period of power transfer.
Yes, the broken script. What happens is that the period is a very complex one. This period of the East India Company. So to sum it up in one uh, descriptive title was a bit of a challenge. So my publishers and I, in consultation, decided to go with this. It is actually a literary allusion, the broken script. It comes from a particular couplet in Urdu, a शेर by a poet who's not very well known, Qadir Baksh Sabir. And he wrote, बस के बेदार से टूटे हैं मकाने दहली, हो रकम खते शिकस्ता से बयाने दहली. Which means that so unjustly have the houses of Delhi been broken that the account of Delhi should be written in the Shikasta script. Shikasta script means literally it is broken script. It's a script of Urdu. So that is what he was talking about. He was talking about the devastation after 1857. But I felt that this broken script could be a very good metaphor for this period. There is so many disjunctures and disruptions of this period and the period that immediately follows it. So I thought it was apt. This is a very fascinating period politically in Delhi because though the Mughal emperor, in many ways symbolically, was still important as a Mughal emperor in the sense that a lot of Indian powers, the Marathas, the Rajputs, the various successor states, as we call them, were still acknowledging the Mughal emperor as the legitimate sovereign and minting coins in his name. Even the East India Company was doing it. But in effect, it was the East India Company which was ruling even Delhi. The Mughal emperor's power was only restricted to the Red Fort. He was there and he ruled over his own extended family. So that was the extent of his power. But at the same time, he had a lot of symbolic authority. A lot of people revered him as the real emperor. And the British also, at least for a long time, continued to rule under his shadow, in the sense that in his name, on his behalf. That was the pretense that was kept up. For the British, Delhi had two significant factors attached to it. One, of course, was the fact that the Mughal emperor was here. So, wherever the Mughal emperor was, control over the Mughal emperor was a very important factor. If you controlled the Mughal emperor, you could, in a sense, say that you are ruling on behalf of the main source of sovereignty in India. So, that was a very important thing. Just the fact that the Mughal emperor was there. Secondly, also, Delhi at this point was at the northwest frontier for the British possessions, because beyond that lay Punjab, etc., which was not in their direct control, was not in their control. So, therefore, it was a very important frontier area, and it was where it was surrounded by a lot of independent powers also, whom they had to have these diplomatic ties with. So, Delhi was an important center for that point. And this period also actually is not a monolithic period. There is a lot of variation within this period. There's a lot of change that happens within this period. And one of those changes is that slowly, as the British consolidate their position in India, by 1818 they defeat the Marathas. When they start ruling Delhi in 1803, the Marathas are still a force which is against them. So by 1818 they have defeated the Marathas. Slowly they defeat or subjugate all the powers that are around. All they enter into the subsidiary treaties with various Indian powers. So they are the preeminent power in India, and then they feel confident enough that they don't need to pretend to be ruling on behalf of the Mughal Emperor. And from that period on, they start slowly discarding this pretense. So they stop using the emperor's name on their coins. They start telling other powers not to use the name of the Mughal emperor. You know, the Mughal emperor used to give titles and other honors to different powers. They start putting an end to that. Slowly, they start, even by the time you come to the 1850s, they have come to the point that they are saying after the Mughal emperor dies, Bahadur Shah, they will not recognize a Mughal emperor at all. They will remove the royal family from the Red Fort. So that symbolic power also is being cut down. And the Mughal emperors, they have no actual power. They don't have armies to counter this or fight the British or anything. All they can do is they use various symbols. They use diplomatic missions also. And diplomatic missions, Akbar II uses Ram Mohan Roy. He sends Ram Mohan Roy and Ram Mohan Roy is, of course, this great Bengal reformer. And Akbar II gives him the title of Raja and sends him as a diplomat to put his case before the court of directors of the East India Company in Britain. So that happens. In fact, Bahadur Shah also does the same thing. Not Ram Mohan Roy, but George Thompson, who is an anti-slavery activist. So the Mughals were also, in very creative ways, in very aware ways, they were aware of the politics that is going on, and they are also trying to use that politics to try and fight back to some extent, though of course it is not ultimately effective. A lot of people have written about this. For instance, William Dalrymple in White Mughal did write a lot about these kind of relationships which were between specifically British men and Indian women, and how that is part of sort of a gentler kind of period of British colonialism, where you have these men, British administrators, British soldiers, who are at the same time sort of much more immersed in Indian culture and Indian society. Where I kind of like to bring in a little bit of nuances there is that I say that these things cannot be seen outside the power dynamics that are there between militarily ascendant power and those which are relatively less powerful. I give this example in my book of James Skinner. Now, James Skinner is a very well-known figure, the founder of Skinner's Horse, which is actually still a regiment in the Indian Army. And his background, his father was an English soldier in the company's army. And James' mother, they say that when the company went to war against Banaras, that suppressed a sort of a revolt by the ruler of Banaras, in the war, this 14-year-old girl fell into his hands. Now you can imagine what falling into the hands of a soldier actually means. And it is said that then that became a permanent kind of relationship, and she had 6 children from him, and James was one of them. And of course, the James's biographer, who's the very famous artist James Bailey Fraser, he writes that James's father treated his mother very kindly, and they had a long life together. That sort of thing glosses over the fact that when James was 12 years old, his mother killed herself because her daughters were forcibly taken from her and sent to boarding school. So, you're looking at a relative powerlessness in this situation where the woman really doesn't have any agency. Population is kind of evenly balanced. There are about slightly less than 50% of the population of Delhi are Muslim, a little more than 50% are Hindu and Jain. Uh, what happens with the triumph of the East India Company is that the Muslims suffer a little decline in their power, and that is because uh, most of the Muslims were in jobs which now decline. So many of them were, for instance, in the military. Now the war is over, the military has gone, and the British don't recruit senior officers into their armies from Indians. The second thing is the service nobility, the people who had manned the upper echelons of the Mughal bureaucracy or even the Maratha bureaucracy. Now all the upper bureaucracy is actually filled by British people, by Europeans. So Indians don't have a place in that. The Hindu and Jain position is less affected because these are people who are often in trade. So I give the example of so many of the Jain merchants who actually do very well because for them it's not such an they were the bankers of the Mughals, they were the bankers of the Marathas, and now they are the bankers of the East India Company. So their relative position does not change that much. I think we need to understand two aspects which are a characteristic of Delhi and the people of Delhi in this period. One is there is this very strong tradition of learning, and of course, learning as well as literature and poetry and all those things. But a very strong culture of learning, and even though in the 18th century, a lot of the, say, colleges and schools and all had shut down because of the political upheaval that was happening, there had still been this tradition of learning had survived because it was such that even a person who was, say, a bureaucrat, who was a judge, who was a administrator, in their free time they would teach students, so that tradition of learning had survived. Secondly, Delhi was a place which had always, it was a cosmopolitan place. It had been the Mughal capital. It was very receptive to new people, to new ideas. So what happens in this period is that with the coming of peace, once the East India Company is triumphant, then there's no war happening, there is peace. So things settle down. After a while, then educational institutions begin to reopen. The British themselves open the Delhi College. And the people of Delhi are really receptive, at least some of them, the educated class, are receptive to these new ideas. Lot of intellectual ferment happens. There are people like Master Ramchandar, who is a scientist, and he's a alumnus of the Delhi College. He also begins to teach there, and he does a lot of interesting writing on original writing. But he also does things like translations of scientific texts into Urdu, which is the lingua, which is what they are, the popular language of the time. And he also starts scientific journals to propagate scientific knowledge among a popular audience.